Suman, thank you very much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good as well. You'll be joining Risk Minds International and talk about the IBOR discontinuation. Tell me, what should banks be keeping an eye on?
So, IBOR discontinuation is a major change being introduced in the context of the existing kind of operating model of the bank. And I will approach this question from the point of view of model risk management. So my background is that of a quant, and I look after specifically portfolio models around risk and capital and P&L attribution and stress testing and so on. Now, why model risk management? And the reason is because we have a current estate of pricing models, portfolio models, models for VaR and capital, and valuations and the like. And these models are currently being used for the generation of metrics for valuations and risk management, day-to-day risk management. Now, with the discontinuation of IBOR, a major fundamental kind of building block, which is sort of discount factors and forward rates, in terms of deriving these from the market, and their use in pricing is essentially a fundamental building block that is changing, right? So as a result of that, essentially all numbers that we compute are changing. Now, there is an operating model of the bank in terms of how the front office interacts with clients for risk management and supporting our clients. Then there is internal risk management. There is finance functions, we're responsible for our P&L and management of the balance sheet. And if this change is happening in terms of all these metrics are impacted, then everything that we do around in terms of explaining changes to metrics as we kind of go through in our journey, that is impacted. So it's a major logistical challenge, I would say, in terms of when you look at it from the change that is being introduced. So you've got various different functions currently who operate together as part of that operating model to currently manage the BAU state of the bank. And then into that, this big change is being introduced. So from a question of around what banks should be keeping an eye on, I think the broader piece fits in with, how do you program manage this major transition? How do you have a clear view of how each area operates, and how do they what are the interrelationships between each other? And how do you then make sure that if there are sequencing needs required, and a specific example is, as a quant, we are working on, round the clock pretty much on building the new products, building the new models in order to support our traders and our clients. But the work that we do have then to be validated by our companion teams in risk. And then likewise, their work might need to be validated by somebody else. So it's a chain of activities which have to happen. And in order to kind of meet the deadline and complete everything that we need to do from an internal governance perspective as well, you have to make sure we have to finish our work, then other teams have to finish their work. And it's this sequencing is an extremely kind of important thing. And from the question around what should we people keeping an eye on, I think it is this thing which needs to be managed very, very closely. That are we all tracking to our deadlines, and especially those handovers between different teams and the responsibilities of different teams. So as in my team, I need to be fully aware that once my work is finished, somebody else's work starts. So how do we make sure we also facilitate those teams as well? And in my own planning, I take that into consideration, that and if you find, as would normally be the case always, that certain things would go faster, certain things would go slower, and it is really about working with your with those other teams, so that we all collectively keep an eye on the deadline and make sure we plan between ourselves so that very well, such that if we are kind of going to be late on something, then we can revisit the plan and reorganize so that the final deadline is not affected, but internally we sort of manage it better and replan. So that's what I would say a key activity which is continuously needed to have a close lens on how each team's activities are progressing. And if there are delays, managing those and replanning continuously so that the final deadline is maintained.
So this is a really multifaceted challenge that banks are facing right now. And you mentioned all these people involved, but how could they prepare for for when each element is done and dusted?
So how could each can prepare? I think this is where what needs to happen, or should have already happened, because if people are starting now, it's obviously too late, is to have a very good handle on the operating model of the bank in terms of how does that bank actually operate, in terms of supporting its customers, and also in terms of its own internal kind of risk management and day-to-day activities. Understanding that operating model, understanding who all are involved and what the relationships are amongst each of these groups. So sort of starting from that macro view, one needs to understand that operating model very well, and then understand what are the handovers are between each of these individual areas. So if you are looking at, and I talked about quant functions, the models, and we talked about, so typically you have got sort of quants in front of you, so you've got quants in risk management, you've quants in finance, each have their own responsibilities, and there are those kind of linkages which are there. So then likewise, you have the situation where on the technology side, the models that quants write will have to be deployed into production. So making sure that you have that view of the operating model that we have, the current operating model. And remember, the operating model itself is not changing, right? But what is changing is a big change is being introduced into this operating model. And therefore, from a program management perspective, having a clear visibility of this operating model and building out a plan where how does that sequencing, the relationships and the sequencing of activities is the critical part of it. And once you have that framework, then providing the relevant support to these different divisions in terms of what do they need in order to make their own changes in their areas of the operating model, or what needs to come out from those areas and help facilitate those things in those handovers, in those data transfers. There could be regulatory submissions which a team has to make. So you have to make sure other teams who have to provide data or information to that team, those things are actually also put onto a big plan. That is extremely crucial. And then of course you need to have the governance framework, the senior stakeholder bodies, the working groups that have to be put in. Again, these should already have been done, and I'm expecting every bank to have already put this framework in place. And it is really making sure that that framework has been designed properly. There is clarity in that framework, and there is communication amongst all the relevant parties within that framework, because that's the crucial element to make this a success.
And of course, we're getting quite close to the deadline now, but what are the hurdles remaining that banks need to overcome?
I think when we say hurdles, hurdles is kind of the things that we were just discussing earlier, which is making sure that those synchronizations between is happening properly across the teams, right? This is a major change, as we all know. And there is a lot of people who are involved into sort of working through all of these things. There are resourcing challenges, in the sense that you are also working on BAU, business as usual, business continuity, whilst at the same time you're preparing for the new state, right? So how do you make sure that you're adequately resourced, your work is adequately prioritized continuously, and understanding what are the big picture items that needs to be addressed first, and not to get bogged down too much in the minutiae in certain kind of things, but rather making sure that these big pieces have to first fall in place. So I think I wouldn't say hurdles. The way I kind of approach it is more about this thing that this can become a hurdle if adequate resourcing, adequate prioritization, adequate funding, and adequate focus. If these things are not put in place, and we deviate from that, that will start putting challenges ahead of us. And I'm sure every bank is, as it goes through this journey, is already experiencing those kind of challenges. And it is important that one needs to look at it and from a program management side, senior management side, to provide them the relevant guidance to tackle these things quickly and effectively and balance things out so that things can keep moving.
Suman, thank you very much for joining me today. I'll see you at the event.
My pleasure. And likewise, looking forward to the event next week.